Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard. I'll be back on camera starting next week, I'm just not quite feeling up to it yet. I'm recovering okay, so don't worry, it's just going to be a bit of a slog. Anyway, for today, I've got another episode of utterly pointless comparisons for you. I'll be looking at the arcade and NES versions of Alien Syndrome. I'll be comparing the US versions of both. Yes, I know Famicom Alien Syndrome has a few minor differences, but these are the ways I was able to play these games when they were new, so that's how I'm looking at them now. I'll keep this opening short and sweet this week. Alien Syndrome is an overhead run and gun that's part commando and part gauntlet, except it adds hostages to rescue and big boss fights into the mix. You can choose from one of two characters, or you can enjoy two-player simultaneous action in both of these versions. There are 6 main rounds and one final boss after them in each game. Sega released the arcade game in 1987. Tengen, a branch of Atari, released the NES game in 1988. Now get this, on NES, we have a Sega game released by Atari for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Talk about cross-pollination! The arcade game isn't exactly a masterpiece, but NES Alien Syndrome is very cut back as you might expect. It has all the levels of the arcade game, but fewer enemies on screen, is slower, and a few of the bosses and regular enemies have been changed very much. Oh well, at least it's way better than the semi-disastrous Sega Master System release. I might take a look at that one on its own another time. Alright, recording methodology. I did use save states in both versions of the game. The arcade game, as I mentioned, is way faster, so you'll see a lot of pauses in this one. Really? That's it. Alright, let's get on with it. First, the NES port is missing the story text at the beginning. As the game gets going, we also see it is, of course, missing the parallax scrolling of the arcade game. Not much of a surprise there. The colors are a lot different between the two games, as you'll see here, and like I said earlier, the NES game is much slower. To the NES game's credit, it does stick pretty closely to the arcade's level layouts. The NES game is also missing the options you can collect to have fire behind you, and it's also missing the grenade weapon. There are also far fewer enemies on NES and fewer shots on screen, which is to be expected with the hardware differences. As we go on, we'll see that the enemies can sometimes differ between the two games. It's also worth pointing out here that the arcade game is full screen. Meanwhile, on NES, there's a rather large window at the top of the screen that occupies like a fifth or a sixth of the entire screen. Oh, and in the NES game, one of the other main differences is that you have to save all of the hostages before the door to the boss fight will open. In the arcade, you just have to save a set amount that varies by level. You can usually happily leave several of your comrades behind to die if you are so inclined. Speaking of bosses, here's the first. Hey look, he's slightly larger on NES. How about that? This boss is similar in both versions, minus the black background of course. The reason the bosses are on a black background on NES is because, well, the bosses are backgrounds. Okay, he's dead now. Let's move on. Oh yeah, I hadn't mentioned yet, but all of the speech from the arcade game has been cut out of the NES version of the game. So, yeah, they did that. And yeesh, Sega, the arcade version of this level always hurts my eyes with its weird repeating see-through floor pattern. I actually think the floor here looks a little nicer on NES. Now you can destroy these monster generators, but frankly it's not worth the effort. They take a lot of hits, and it's much easier to just run past and avoid them. You can also fire a lot more projectiles with the fireball weapon at one time in the arcade game. If you're not too familiar with Alien Syndrome, you want the laser for pretty much every boss fight. The hostages look much different in the two games.
Go to the exit.
Once again, you'll see that I complete the arcade level much faster than the NES level. As a reminder, this is caused by two things: your slower movement speed on NES, and the fact that you have to rescue every hostage for the boss door to open up in that version. I've gotta say, while it doesn't exactly make for compelling viewing, that playing the game on NES is not so bad even though it's a bit slower. It doesn't feel tremendously slow while you're actually playing it. But yeah, watching it back afterwards, it definitely is a bit slow, isn't it? Since I've got a little bit of time to kill here, let me do that by talking about the best 8-bit version of Alien Syndrome. And that is the Game Gear version. Yeah, it's not quite the same game as the arcade one or the NES or even the Master System game. It's its completely own thing. The gameplay is similar to the arcade game, it's faster than the NES game, and all of the weapons can be powered up. So it actually adds a lot of things that are not present in the original that make it a little more fun to play. It is a bit shorter though, it's only got 4 levels, but it's definitely worth tracking down if you've never seen it. As you can see, Boss 2 is quite different in each game. He's a mass of sprites in the arcade game, while in NES he's constructed of fewer and smaller parts. To make up for this, they give him, or it, or whatever, a second form that you have to take care of before you can go on. And if you come into this fight without the laser in the arcade game, holy cow, are you in for an ordeal. Remember when I said you should get the laser to fight all the bosses? I meant that. Make sure you do that if you give this game a try yourself. I would say the same thing basically applies on the NES, even though the bosses themselves are often at least a little bit different.
Round 3. The time bomb is set.
Okay, some weird color choices on NES here, with sort of a yellowy-green background. It's decidedly unpleasant to look at, but that's what they went with. The arcade colors in this stage are much nicer. Also, if you hadn't noticed, when you start a stage, you always start with your plain old pea shooter. That's right, your power-ups do not carry over between levels. We'll see once again in this round that we finish it much faster in the arcade for the usual reasons. This area can be kinda agonizing on NES because of how slow it is. But don't worry, we're getting there. Something else I'll point out on NES is that when you hit enemies, there's a slight delay between when they take damage and actually die. This is pretty annoying.
Go to the exit.
And I've gotta say, on the NES version, I really wish they would have included some options. A good option to have would have been how many hostages to rescue per level. They could have set it so you either had to save the same amount as the arcade game, or all of them, or fewer for sort of an easier mode. Like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't feel so terrible when you're playing it, but there are times where I definitely wished that I could have gotten to that exit much earlier and just completed the level. For some of the later maze-like levels in particular, like this one, it really is kind of annoying to have to find every single hostage. Maybe it would have worked better if they could have added like an arrow or something to point you to where the next one is. Just anything to make the game a little bit friendlier. Oh well, what are you gonna do? It is what it is, right? Okay, here's Boss 3. He's way different in each game. In the arcade, you have to shoot all the background to clear a path to him, and then shoot all his legs out, and then the dangly things in his eye sockets. On NES, it's all about the eye sockets. In the arcade, he also slowly approaches you, while on NES, he just kinda wanders back and forth. And as you can see, much like the levels themselves, some of these modified boss fights take much longer on NES than they do in the arcade original. I do think with some of these boss fights, the developers really didn't hone in on what makes boss fights fun. These are really more just a test of endurance most of the time. And by endurance, I mean yours. Round 4, and I have to give the developers credit. As far as the looks go, they translated this one very nicely to the NES. The enemies are a lot different, with segmented worm things in the arcade, and faster moving slime enemies on NES. I'll point out here that when you pull up the map on the NES, the game pauses while it's open. In the arcade, the little map overlay stays on screen for a few moments, allowing you to look at it while you move around a bit. One thing I'll point out gameplay-wise that applies to both versions of the game is you're much better off just running past enemies in this game whenever possible. Really, you only want to shoot enemies when you absolutely have to. In general, there's really never any reason to stay and fight them. You want to keep moving at all times. Especially in the arcade game, that time limit can be a little bit tighter than it seems. You've got some wiggle room, but you definitely don't want to waste any for no reason. As per usual, the arcade level is done way faster. In this case, I finished it almost twice as fast as the NES port. As far as any other differences between the games here go, well, it's pretty much par for the course. We've got the parallax scrolling in the arcade with the star layer underneath the station, and on the NES we've got some slightly different patterns for the tile set. But I will say again, I think they did a really good job of making this level look good in the NES port and very similar to the arcade version. Oh, and there are a few power-ups where I haven't really mentioned what they do yet, so I might as well do that now while we're killing another minute or so. The F power-up is a flamethrower, and that is present in both versions of the game. The flamethrower is a short-range weapon that fires a continuous flame, as you might expect, and it's not really particularly useful in either version of the game, but it's definitely worse on NES. And in the NES version, we also have a W power-up on the wall, which is a warp that sends you to a different part of the level. The warp power-up is, oddly enough, also present in the Sega Master System version of the game, but it is not in the arcade original. Alright, the fourth boss. He's completely different in both versions, yet equally pretty easy. As you can see, I take care of him in no time in both. Alright, second to last round. This level is pretty large and the colors are way different between the two versions. The enemies are similar at least. I'll say that as a colorblind gamer, sometimes I have a hard time seeing the hostages in certain areas of the arcade original. On NES, they stick out a little bit more. Now I feel like in this round, the gameplay is pretty varied between the two versions. In the arcade, there's a lot more enemies on screen, and they're really fast. Now they're pretty fast on NES, but they're not even in the same league as the ones in the arcade game. And these little speed demons in the arcade original form from the ground very quickly for monster makers that look suspiciously like a certain part of the female anatomy. I don't want to read too much into anything, but I have a feeling the designers of this game maybe weren't quite such a hit with the ladies. Why is that? Well, if you look at pretty much every level, you'll find a monster design or a monster house that looks suspiciously like a vagina. And watch me abandon this poor hostage as I head into the boss room. Maybe he shouldn't have eaten that bagged lunch with my name on it. Anyway, bear with me on NES here. We've still got quite a few rescues to do. We'll get there, but it'll be another minute or two. Which reminds me, the timers are different in each game, both in how much time they give you and in how quickly that time passes. Either way, we're getting there, don't worry. Okay, so for this level, I'll also say, as far as differences go between the two versions, the tile set looks very different on NES compared to the arcade game. If you look at the walls, they almost have more of an organic look on NES versus the arcade where they look much more mechanical. In the arcade, we also have a nice see-through glass parallax layer, and we get a look outside of the station where we can see it's on some kind of solid ground. Perhaps an asteroid, since we can see space underneath it. On the NES, we really don't even get a hint of those things. Now let's talk about the hilarious difference between the hostages in both versions of the game. You see, in the arcade game, most of the hostages are stuck to the ground with some kind of alien goop that clearly causes them to not be able to move. Meanwhile, on NES, all the hostages are just kind of standing in place, waving at you, instead of actually moving under their own power like they are clearly able to. Why is that? Don't know. Great question. We'll just have to chalk it up as one of the many mysteries of NES Alien Syndrome. Okay, boss fight. Once again, completely different between the two games. In the arcade, we've got sort of a whack-a-mole thing going on here, while on NES we get a big dragony monster to take out. He's actually pretty easy in both.
Round 6.
Here we are in the final area. Once again, we have garish colors in the NES port, with yellowy orange colors for the background, and in the arcade game it's more tan in the foreground and blue for the background. At least, that's what one of my non-colorblind sons tells me. I give full props and kudos to the developers for sticking fairly close to the arcade layout and design here. I really wish the Master System version had been more like this one. That one features single-screen push-scrolling, sort of like the first Legend of Zelda game, with completely different level layouts. Now here's a level where I think gameplay-wise, the arcade version really stands apart from the NES one. I mean, it's very fast, very fluid, we have lots of enemies on screen, the way that the aliens crawl out of the walls is a lot smoother, they fire a lot more at you, and it's just much more of an action game when there's a lot more going on. On the NES, they did their best, but This level is just much slower paced, there's fewer enemies, and they don't fire at you nearly as much here. Now, as you can see, there are parts where you'll get accosted by up to about 3 of these aliens at a time, but they move pretty slowly and, I mean, really, they barely ever fire. It really gives this level a completely different feel from the arcade game. Anyway, as per usual, I have once again finished the arcade level way faster than the NES one because of the aforementioned speed and hostage rescue differences between the two versions. I guess the biggest thing I can point out on this level is that in the arcade version it really feels like your climactic final level because of the amount of enemies, how they swarm you, and how much they fire at you. Meanwhile, on NES, it doesn't have that feeling. It just feels like another step on the path towards the ending. Like there's nothing special about it, and there should be more after this. But the thing is, of course, there isn't more after this. This is the final standard level. So I would say, at least from sort of a gameplay balancing standpoint, the NES version kind of fails here. Hey, the boss is actually pretty similar in the two games again. Don't worry, for the very last boss, the NES version will return to its tradition of making the bosses considerably different from the arcade original. I love that in the arcade version, the projectiles that the boss shoots out at you look like a bunch of little Mr. Potato Heads. Looking at them, I can't help but think they should be voiced by John Ratzenberger in the movie. It takes a little more doing, and the death isn't as satisfying or gruesome on the NES, but hey, at least we're done.
Round 7. The time bomb is
Alright,
set.
the last mission is simply the final boss fight, which is radically different in each version of the game. In the arcade, if you don't know what you're doing, it'll wreck you quickly. But all you really need to do is just step left or right to avoid its swirling projectiles, depending on the sequence. On NES, it's really more of an endurance test than anything else. I've actually gone and sped the video up to twice the normal speed because it takes so long to kill the stupid thing in that version of the game. And hey, at least we've got this fantastic music that's not at all annoying to listen to while we spend forever fighting this thing. What? No, I wasn't being sarcastic. What's wrong with you? After a while, hey, it's finally over. Congrats, and enjoy a picture of players 1 and 2 hugging. Bah, I give them a month. So on the NES, we can see that the last thing we were on, I guess, crashes into the Earth, which doesn't seem like a very happy ending, does it? Meanwhile, in the arcade version, that doesn't happen at all. And while I did pause it here in the arcade after its ending sequence, that's because it just loops and starts over in round 1 after that. Meanwhile, on the NES, it takes kind of forever for it to get through the ending text that was on a single screen in the arcade game. And it does follow this, of course, with the staff credit roll. Finally, the horror is over. time to wrap this up. Alien Syndrome is not Sega's best work. I feel like it hasn't held up as well as most of their other popular games from the late 80s. It's okay, but it's kind of brutal if you haven't played it before and are just getting used to it now. The NES port is the best of the US released ports of the game, but as you can see, while the level layouts are pretty faithful, it's just so much slower and severely cut back for the NES hardware. In the end, it's tough to recommend either version of the game today, but the arcade version is still head and shoulders better than the NES port. And like I said earlier, the Sega Master System version is kinda terrible. It's a pretty sad display for a contemporary home port of what was a marquee Sega arcade game at the time. So that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe for more retro gaming goodness. If you want to support the channel, you can now do that at Patreon or Ko-fi. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.